So good to see each of you. Thank you very, 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 very much for coming. For those of you who are streaming, we welcome you. We're so very glad to have you at All Saints Church today. For those of you who are visiting with us, we have red welcome bags up at the red welcome table. We'd love for you to take those with you. We would love for you to be on our mailing list every Thursday morning, every Thursday afternoon. I send out an email blast to about 10,000 people, I think. So we have places where you can sign up for that here and also at the red welcome table. It is a thrill to welcome back to All Saints Church one of All Saints' most favorite troublemakers in the world. Michael Lapsley is originally from New Zealand, is that right? Yes. A monk. He was on the hit list of the apartheid government in South Africa. He was a member of the African National Congress, came back from vacation, opened a letter bomb, which rendered him without both of his hands and one of his eyes. And he has dedicated his life before that point, and certainly since then, to God's agenda of justice and peace, and certainly healing. And as we said in the sermon this morning, God is all about calling us in to God's work, that the dance and energy of God's love is doing to heal and make whole the world. I know of no one in the world and in history who has done a more masterful and fruitful job of saying, yes, send me, to God's energy of love and healing. No telling what he's going to talk about when he actually gets up here. But I love it when he comes and not only talks about healing, but also gives a perspective from his work as a globe-trotting healer to talk about how the United States can do a better job of being more about healing than traumatizing. So will you please warmly welcome our dear, dear friend, Father Michael Lapsley.
Thank you, Ed. It's always a delight to be back here at All Saints. As Ed was introducing me, there was something that I've been very conscious of for a time, is that for a Christian, healing is never for healing's sake. Healing is never the end. And if you look at the healing stories in the New Testament, the response of people being healed is to follow Jesus on the way. So we are healed in order that we may be participants in God's project for a kinder, gentler, more just world, what we like to call the kingdom of God. That's just my PS on his sermon. Here in the United States, the Institute for Healing of Memories works in a number of different contexts. So, for example, in New York, we work with women who have been abused or also disabled. We work in relation to a number of faith communities. So we have just been with one of the refugees from All Saints, Pasadena, Wilma Jacobson, who said to me, give the people of All Saints my love. Yeah, we were just there in Cupertino with my colleague Theo Mukambiwa. Do you want Theo just want to stand up? And we had a Healing of Memories workshop in Cupertino last week. We also work in Hawaii. Some people say that's an oxymoron. But of course, like all beautiful places, there's plenty of pain below the surface. And we work with women in Hawaii, particularly women out of prison. And a disproportionate number of women who end up in prison in Hawaii are native Hawaiians. But in Arizona and Minnesota, we work with war veterans, in particular, homeless war veterans. And some of you will be aware of the shameful truth that a disproportionate number of the homeless people of the United States are in fact war veterans. On this trip, we had a workshop with war veterans in Arizona. And there's a point in the workshop, and I should just mention we're just completing this afternoon a Healing of Memories workshop here at All Saints. But at this particular point in the workshop, we say, are there any issues or questions that people would like to discuss? And somebody said, I would like us to talk about moral injury. And I said, yes, let's talk about that, but can we add the words spiritual injury? Now, I want to ask you at this point, how many of you are conversant with the term moral injury? Just put up your hands. Okay, some, okay. So there's still an education program, Father. There's still work to be done. Now, how many of you have heard of PTSD? Exactly, everybody. What was it they called it in a previous war, Ed? They called it... Thank you, Ed. There's a lot of Eds here, eh? You know, when Nelson... When Nelson Mandela died, I said in South Africa, there are many Nelson Mandelas. So there are many Ed Bacons. So PTSD has become a word that we are all conversant with. And PTSD speaks to the way in which trauma affects the body. And there is post-traumatic stress disorder. And I have a line which some people get slightly shocked by, and that is, I say, I am delighted that people get PTSD who have been to war. The ones you should worry about are the ones who can kill each other and they're not affected. The fact that when we kill each other, we get sick is a sign of our humanness. It's a sign that we're not hardwired to kill each other, and when we do, we get ill. So PTSD has become part of the discourse. You hear it all over the world. People, and sometimes appropriately and sometimes not appropriately. But as I say, it speaks to the physical and the psychological effects of trauma, and in particular of war in people. So what then is moral injury? And what is spiritual injury? We know as we grow up as children, we develop a sense of what is right and what is wrong. As we grow up, our conscience develops further and further. And there's a discussion, an academic discussion about when we can say the conscience is fully developed. It becomes relevant when sometimes kids commit crimes. At what point can you say somebody is morally responsible? But we also learn morality from our parents. We also learn it in the church. We learn that there are 10 commandments, and one of them is that you shall not kill. So what happens? People grow up, they've learnt these values, they've learnt the sense of universal morality, a set of a moral code and a moral law that applies to us in relation to every other human being on the planet. Then we grow up, and then our country says to us, we're going to put a uniform on you, and we'll give you weapons, and you can kill people. And it won't, we have decided, we the government have decided, that that's not murder. It's okay. And we'll when you come back, we'll give you medals, the band will play, and we'll say, you're a hero. And if the war's unpopular, of course we want people just to disappear. If the war is unpopular, we want people to disappear. If it's popular, we're happy for the marchers and the band to play. But in neither case do we want to hear, as we go shopping, the nightmares that particularly men, but also women who are soldiers, carry for the rest of their lives. And partly it's that physical effect, but it's partly the moral injury. Because there is a voice that in you that says, I should not be doing what I'm doing. And there's a lot been written about how in the most wars of history, even when the soldiers line up and begin to shoot each other, and the kind of wars of the past, there's always been a problem because most soldiers shot over the heads of the other soldiers. Because there's a moral code in us. And the generals have always wanted us to get more and more accurate so that in fact we will kill people. So the moral injury. But what's the spiritual injury? We as people of faith assert that every human being is made in the image and likeness of God. So we are asserting that there is something of the divine in all of us. So when I kill another human being, I'm not only attacking the divine in you, I'm attacking the divine in myself. But you see, one of the reasons we don't want to know the stories is because perhaps we would have to face the fact that we as societies who send our children to war, the moral and spiritual injury applies to us too. that we may not have shot anybody, we may not have tortured anybody, but it's been done in our name and on our behalf. Now, I want to say to you that I have come to the conclusion that the soul of the United States is infected by the addiction of this country to war and to unending war. And neither side of politics is interested in stopping those wars. So it's not about whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. Because both sides of politics are too much embedded with the military industrial complex. I again have been delighted to read that the people who run the drones program are getting sick. Isn't that wonderful? Those men who, I don't know whether they're men and women or just men, but they sit, I don't know, is it in Virginia? Where do they sit? They sit somewhere. And they sit in front of a screen. And they watch a house in Pakistan. And they get to know everybody in the house because they see the women, the men, the children, the grandparents going in and out of the house. And then at a certain point, they push a button. And then, and this has been written up by a study, Stanford and one other university, I don't know whether it was NYU, then they practice what they call double tapping. And double tapping is when 15 minutes later, when everybody's come to, heard the explosion, and has come to help, they tap again. Who's the young girl who got the Nobel Prize? Mahala. Who said in the White House to President Obama, please stop sending drones to kill our people. But again, it speaks to moral and spiritual injury. You know that the United States spends 9 times as much on the military than on public education. Now, of course, there's another dimension. In a week's time, I'm going to Japan. It's my first time to go to Japan. I'm going there because the book that some of you have read, Redeeming the Past, My Journey from Freedom Fighter to Healer, is being published in Japanese. And I'll be there for a week, and I'll go to Hiroshima. And my father was a soldier in the Second World War. He fought in the Pacific against the Japanese. Fortunately for us, I never heard him say anything negative about Japanese people. But he was somebody like many old soldiers who never spoke about his experience. But I've been thinking about, what do I say at Hiroshima? Because I belong to that side that carried out the greatest crime against humanity the world has known. I was just reading that 60 scientists wrote to Truman saying, don't drop the bomb. And I've been reading how it was all over. There was no need for that nuclear weapon. And certainly there was no need for the second one. So we did it. The German philosopher Karl Jaspers speaks about 4 kinds of guilt. It's worth a read. He talks about criminal guilt, those who directly carry out certain crimes. Then he talks about political guilt, the political chain of command. He talks about moral guilt, the guilt of the things that were done in our name and on our behalf. And then he speaks, in order to take no prisoners, metaphysical guilt. That in the end, it's what we as a human family are capable of. So what's our response? You know, when I was a young white student in South Africa, we had a way of coping with our guilt. We used to drink bad red wine. And all that did was give us a headache. I think there's healthy guilt and unhealthy guilt. Unhealthy guilt is where we beat ourselves up and say, woe is us, we are bad. But we have heard good news. Interestingly, the Japanese bishops have just, on the 70th anniversary of the Second World War, have called for every Anglican in Japan, of whom there are about 10, but nevertheless, have called them to be symbols of peace. And they as a church have come out with a statement some years ago about the responsibility of all Japanese people, war responsibility. They are owning their part in the militarism that led to that horrific war. So owning responsibility is part of the journey. Be able to say, we did it, it was done in our name, on our behalf. So we share the guilt, we share the complicity. But surely, if we've heard the good news, we're called to be symbols of peace. We are called to play our part in healing the wounds of competence. But we're called to have the courageous conversation about what war is doing to our people. We're called to be peacemakers. And you see, that is healthy guilt. And my feeling about All Saints in the time I've known it, which is only a short time, 1991 I first came to this church, is you've paid your part, I think in healthy guilt, because you haven't been afraid to acknowledge a complicity with evil and injustice. Whether it's your big banner against torture or your role in calling for peace in Vietnam. But like never before, there needs to be a new peace movement in the United States of America. And there need to be and we learned in the struggle for peace in Vietnam that 1 and 1 and 1 make a million. So we may start to be lonely voices. But we need to be ahead. We need to be showing the way for a nation. We need to be, one thing Nelson Mandela taught us, that enemies can become friends. My goodness, even Fidel and Raul and Obama shaking hands? Wow. You're a bit slow to get the message, but thank goodness. So it's possible to heal the wounds of history, but we can only do it when we acknowledge our part. And if you like, we're all called to become wounded healers. Thank you very much.
Questions for 15 minutes? Thank you.
Thank you.
Please raise your hands and we'll get microphones to you. Here's the first question right there. Here's one on this side. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Michael, for being here. I'm Chuck Pereira, and I was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War. It was, as with many people of my generation, a very difficult process to get to that point. What do you envision today? What do you envision today as the new peace movement that we can all be a part of?
I think that's something that there's a statement from President Eisenhower, who was the first person who talked about the military-industrial complex, and I'm just trying to think of what the words he talked about, and he talked about the importance of a knowledgeable citizenry. And so partly we have to become knowledgeable about what is done in our name and on our behalf. There is we know about drones, but there's a new form of weaponry that's being developed. Something like automatic weapons that will require no people. See, drones still involve somebody pushing the button. And they now want to develop a set of weapons that won't have any human being involved. And there's a move for a preemptive ban on them. But the United States is reluctant to sign up. So I think there have to be many fronts of that peace movement. And I think part of the peace movement is caring for veterans. We should never make the mistake of saying our opposition to war should mean we don't care for veterans. I think one of the most outrageous things that happened under Bush, you sent children to war and you cut back the support for veterans. That for me was the ultimate cynicism. But I think it always comes down to saying, okay, we're against war, we're peacemakers. Well, what can we do in our context? There's young Christian workers and young Christian students in South Africa. They talk about see, judge, and act. See is gaining the knowledge, gaining the understanding. That's ongoing study. Judging what is right and what is wrong, and then deciding what our actions are. And to say, given the enormity, what will our part be? Given who we are All Saints Church, we're parishioners in this church, what can we do? And it's not for me to say what the answers are, but it's to inspire you, encourage you to pick that up. And of course, it's also about, who was it says that the budget is a sacred document. The budget tells you where the priorities are as well. So that's also an arena of a battleground. But also, we know in the United States that politicians respond to pressure. And if citizenry puts enough pressure on any given issue, that will then show in the votes in the House and in the Senate. So we need to be working in that dimension as well. So that's just a couple of thoughts, but thank you.
Hi, Father Michael. Thanks so much for being here. I remember there was an anniversary of Eisenhower's leaving office, and recounting how going in he talked about how we could build schools instead of task forces, and going out he said, you know, beware the permanent war economy. And here's a Republican military hero, general, and well-loved president who couldn't dig in against the power of this. And yesterday in the LA Times, there was an article about the $40 billion we've spent on anti-nuclear weapons that are, you know, filled with flaws but being deployed anyway. And just the size of the dollars and the inertia behind it is so great that I always, you know, it's easy to feel a little hopeless in the face of that. And how do we find the strength to persevere in the face of something that someone like Dwight Eisenhower certainly, you know, had as good a chance as anyone?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's always important to do what we can to humanize the other. You know, there's a wonderful group of people, 9/11 Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. And these were all people who lost relatives in September the 11th. And they said, you may not go to war in the name of our loved ones. But they didn't just say that. They went to Iraq, they went to Afghanistan. They met families, communities. So the more that the stories of people that we may be thinking we're going to bomb and go to war with, the more we hear the human stories, the more we're going to have the kind of passion and commitment to stop these kind of activities. Because there is the mega stuff. And of course, one of the problems is that those decisions, for example, about drones, they're made by the executive. They're not made by the Congress or by the Senate. They all happen in secret. So rolling back the secrecy, but also we know that, I mean, the most extraordinary thing is that some of the rights that have been guaranteed since the Magna Carta, 800 years, it's this time of celebration about the right to a trial. There have now laws been passed in the United States that take away rights that took 800 years, or began to have those rights 800 years ago, and we've got rid of them in the United States, and people hardly noticed. They hardly said a word about it, and that's partly because of how our fears are exploited in order to take away people's rights. So I'm not directly answering your question, but I think for me, you know, in South Africa, for hundreds of years, black people only ever saw things get worse. They never saw things get better. They saw themselves having less and less rights, more and more violence against them. But they had a hope, because they knew that it's like Archbishop Tutu says, the white man brought us the Bible, we read it. We read it. And said, it's our book, it's our story, you know. So what I used to feel in South Africa, and I mean, my goodness, some of us never thought we'd see a Nelson Mandela become the president of South Africa. But we knew that we walked on the shoulders of giants. And so in the United States, there have been giants, women and men, black and white, who have always dared to stand up for justice, even when the odds were incredibly stacked against them. And I think also we need to also not to lose sight of the link between Black Lives Matter and who dies in war. The disproportionate number of Latino and African Americans. The poor in the United States, in general, not all, but in general, are the ones who fight and die. So I think we need to make that link with the new courageous conversation that has to happen about race and racism in the United States. So I think we shouldn't separate the issue of war from that issue of race and racism, although it has its distinct reality.
Forgive me for saying this, but I was in the British Navy when the atomic bombs were dropped and in Belgium, and we all felt that this was going to end the war, and the fact that we had to drop two because they didn't give up after the first one seemed to be necessary. And I'm sorry, but I still feel that way, that it stopped the Japanese atrocity to the prisoners of war, which was horrible, and it would have been ghastly having to finish the war in battle.
You know, thank you for sharing your viewpoint. The reality is that all communication had broken down after Hiroshima, and there was no the Japanese didn't even have time to make a decision when Nagasaki happened. But you know, you have your opinion. I don't share it, but thank you for sharing that.
Hello? Thank you. It's a very moving presentation and incredibly relevant and important. I have a confession to make, which is that my father, my mother, and my brother are all involved in the war machine. My education was paid for by it, and so complicity has always been something that I have tried to, over the years, gradually understand more and more. And your call for a new peace movement, I think, is right on. The problem is that most Americans don't feel complicity, and I think that we are all complicit in this because our economy, our whole society is bound up in this now. So I'm wondering if you could address that, how we might get to a point where I think white people are beginning to understand this in terms of violence against blacks, but they're very, very far from understanding their complicity in war. And in terms of addressing this, perhaps you could talk a bit about how whites in South Africa began, and my sense is they still don't really understand. So I think it's an analogy, perhaps, but if you could talk about the United States and South Africa and how whites can begin to feel this in their hearts.
Yeah, can I put it in a wider context and say that in the kind of healing work that I'm involved in, I've come to see the importance of both knowledge and acknowledgement. And if I can give you an example from another context, a third context, and that is the Sami people who are the reindeer people of the northern part of Norway, Sweden, Finland. And they said to me, they said, our church has apologized for its part in our oppression. So that's good. So the problem is, for the mainstream of the society, there's no knowledge about what is being acknowledged. And so I've long felt that white America has no comprehension of the pain, which is black America. So yes to the acknowledgement, yes to the apology, but let's learn about, but it's not simply head learning, it's also emotional learning about the kind of pain people have carried across generations. Now, when it came to South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it is true that many white people, let me take back a step. For nearly 5 years, every single day on radio, television, and newspaper was what happened at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it was like we put a giant mirror in front of us to say, this is what we did to each other. Many, many white people turned off the television, didn't read the newspaper, didn't listen to the radio, and still today remain in denial. So what again this speaks to is, how do we put ourselves in a situation that we can hear the pain of the other? Because it's when we are able to share pain that we find ourselves connected and can become galvanized to work against injustice. When I was a student, interestingly, the Anglican Student Federation was the only federation in South Africa, be it Christian or general students, that didn't break up on racial grounds. But because we were all together, again, we're exposed to each other's humanity, and that inspired many of us to fight for a society in which there would indeed be true equality. So again, we go back to Eisenhower's point about we need a knowledgeable citizenry. And so part of the role of a faith community, a progressive faith community, is to keep increasing the knowledge. And of course, we've been fortunate in relation to race and racism, that we've just had a film like Selma. We had 12 Years a Slave. I don't know whether this church has looked at the film Traces of the Trade, a story from the Deep North about slavery on Rhode Island and the complicity of the great family and the way in which the wealth of a whole island in the North was built on slavery. So again, that's the knowledge. But of course, there's no greater knowledge than hearing the human beings who tell their stories as well, and creating the possibility. And after Ed retires, every Sunday you're going to have a different preacher talking about their stories. Is it right?
That's right. So, Father, obviously I'm going to shut you down. Because you're our celebrant at the 11:15 service and we have to go. But you must close by, briefly, by telling us about the pamphlets that are in the chairs. And also, I'm so curious, you've been such a champion in solidarity with Cuba. And we have a different story today. And if you could just address a word there too, but in 45 seconds.
Yeah, the brochure is the brochure for Healing of Memories North America. It has our website. Also, you can learn more about us. You can be in contact. Karen Hayes is a member of this. Karen here? Where's Karen? She's here? Over there. And she's, in fact, now working part-time for the Institute for Healing of Memories North America. You could be in contact with Karen if you want to be more involved in us and the work that we do. And if you felt tempted to write a check, we would not hate you. But the last thing to say is, for 10 years, every time I came to All Saints, I also, during my visit, went to see one of the Cuban Five, one of the Gerardo Hernandez, which was always a bittersweet experience. He's a giant in the human family, but was in prison for helping prevent terrorism from the soil of the United States against Cuba. Now, there's actually a magical story that I'll tell in 10 seconds. His wife had not been allowed to visit for 16 years. And there was a congressman from the United States visiting Cuba, he and his wife, and they met Adriana, the wife of Gerardo, and she said, my biological clock is ticking. We would love to have a child. And this couple chose, the congressman and his wife, to create the possibility for, IVF, so that she could become pregnant. And he arrived back in Cuba in November, and 2 weeks later, their baby was born. But a beautiful story. I mean, a horrible story of pain and suffering, but ended up with something quite beautiful. And I salute President Obama, President Raul Castro, Pope Francis, the Canadians, and who knew the time has come for enemies to become friends.
Thank you, Michael Lapsley.
Thank you.
Very good, Father. Come with me.